Hello and welcome to Bite-Sized Haggai, lesson number 2, titled A Depressed People. We'll be looking at Haggai chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. If you didn't have a chance to listen to lesson 1, I suggest you go back because that gives a very important background and context to the book of Haggai and will be very helpful for you. I'm going to read the verses now. These are taken from the New King James Version, so if you have that Bible at hand, you can follow along or look in the study notes, which are available at the address below this video. So this is Haggai chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. In the second year of King Darius, in the 6th month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying, Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying, This people says, The time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your panelled houses, and this temple to lie in ruins? Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and bring in little. You eat, but do not have enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put into a bag with holes. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountains and bring wood and build the temple, that I may take pleasure in it and be glorified, says the Lord. You looked for much, but indeed it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why, says the Lord of hosts? Because of my house that is in ruins, while every one of you runs to his own house. Therefore the heavens above you withhold the dew, and the earth withholds its fruit. For I called for a drought on the land and the mountains, on the grain and the new wine and the oil, on whatever the ground brings forth, on men and livestock, and on all the labour of your hands. So the first thing to note here is the timing of this message. So the Lord gave Haggai this message on, we are told, the first day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. So that would make the date on our calendars today, August the 29th of the year 520 BC. When the Israelites returned from exile in Babylon, they continued to follow the Babylonian calendar and began their years in the spring rather than in the fall. Each new month began with a new moon, and the Israelites commonly celebrate the occasion with a new moon festival. So interestingly then, and almost certainly intentionally, this first prophetic revelation that God gave in the promised land following the return from exile came on a day when most, if not all, of the Israelites would have been in the vicinity of Jerusalem celebrating the new moon festival. The second thing we note here is that God is giving Haggai this message for a particular audience. He is to give it to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. This means that the drive and initiative for change must come from the top. It's a top-down movement. Certainly the people were at fault in failing to complete the temple, but the impetus for change was to be top-down. Let's now move on then to consider the message itself. As we talked about in lesson 1, when the people first returned from exile, they had been eager and enthused about building the temple. It had been their number one priority. However, as we covered in the historical background last time, when difficulties arose and it became difficult and troublesome, they simply gave up. They justified giving up building the temple by saying that it was just not the right time to do this. This is what they had said. The time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. So working on the temple gradually slipped down their list of priorities to the point where it dropped off the list completely and all building work stopped. Instead of prioritizing God and the things that would please him, they became selfish and self-absorbed. The unfinished temple had lain untouched for 16 years. We note, however, that it was the time to build their own nice houses. We read, "Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your panelled houses, and this temple to lie in ruins?" The expression here, panelled houses, might indicate houses that were quite luxurious with decorative wooden panels. King Cyrus had provided the Jews with money to buy hardwood timber to rebuild the temple. We read about this in Ezra 3, verse 7. Here is that verse. They also gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food, drink, and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, to bring cedar logs from Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa, according to the permission which they had from King Cyrus, king of Persia. So it's certainly possible that the Jews had used this superior imported wood to build their own homes whilst neglecting working on the temple. But it also might be the case that when it refers to panelled here, it may also refer to houses simply with roofs. Whichever of these possibilities applies, the meaning, though, behind it is clear. God is displeased that they had put their own needs and desires for a dwelling place ahead of his. It's worth pausing just for a moment here to note that God is not dependent upon human beings to build him a temple. God is present with us at all times and places, and our relationship with him is not dependent upon having fancy temples, churches, or cathedrals. What is significant and important in this story, though, is that God wanted the people to have him as their number one priority. The most important thing was that they have a dwelling place for God in their midst. When they had put temple work off and tried to excuse themselves from building by saying that it was a bad time, they were in effect saying that they did not need God's presence or involvement in their lives. How had this attitude worked out for the people? Well, not well at all. They had worked hard and struggled, but they were not enjoying the fruits of their hard work. Verse 6 lays out all the ways in which they were suffering. "You have sown much and bring in little." The yields from the crops that they were planting were not as expected. The harvests were poor. "You eat, but do not have enough." They were going hungry due to there being an insufficient amount of food. "You drink, but you are not filled with drink." There was a drought or a severe shortage of water. "You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm." So they perhaps could not produce enough good quality material for warm clothes, or maybe it's referring here to the fact that they were too poor to buy sufficient warm clothing. "And he who earns wages to put into a bag with holes." This section of the verse speaks of economic hardship. The money they earned drained away, and they were unable to save or invest in the future. The inevitable consequence of all of this was depression and despondency. And we can certainly understand this response. This is how we all feel when our hard work ends in bitter failure. Haggai's message then is intended to combat this way of thinking. He seeks to shake them out of this attitude and encourage them to think very carefully about why they are in this miserable state. It is, so God says through Haggai, time to consider your ways. God is asking the people to consider what they have set their hearts and their minds upon. The point being made here is that there is a connection between the bad situation they are facing and their neglect of the temple. As soon as the people stopped putting God first and instead prioritized their own needs, things started to go wrong. This is because God removed his blessings he determined that if the people would neglect him and turn their backs on him, then he would do the same to them. We read, "Therefore the heavens above you withhold the dew." Dew was the only form of moisture that plants enjoyed during the hot summer in Palestine, besides artificial irrigation, of course. But even the dew was unavailable. God had prevented it benefiting the crops. And the earth withholds its fruit. So again, God's cursing on the people was that the crops and the fruits were being prevented from forming and growing properly or abundantly. Also we read, "For I called for a drought on the land, and the mountains on the grain, and on the new wine and the oil, on whatever the ground brings forth, on men and livestock, and on all the labour of your hands." So the land was suffering from a drought, which was affecting what, of course, the land could produce. Grain, wine and oil are the three basic products derived from the land. And the drought affected both people and animals. So God was telling the people through the prophet Haggai that he was in control and responsible for all aspects of the people's existence. What was the remedy to this problem? It was very simple. We read, "Go up to the mountains and bring wood and build the temple, that I may take pleasure in it and be glorified, says the Lord." So the solution to this problem and the way to reverse God's curses and again be blessed was to prioritize God and get back to finishing the temple. The hills of Judah were well wooded in Old Testament times, and from Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 15 we know that olive, myrtle and palm trees were all available in that area. It was customary in the ancient world to set layers of wood in stone walls. This was to minimize damage from potential earthquakes. The wood and heavy timber, long enough to stretch from wall to wall of the temple to support the roof, however, would probably have to be imported. How will the people respond to this first message, this first oracle from the prophet Haggai? We will find out in lesson 3. So what lessons can we learn? What can we take away from the things we've looked at in lesson 2? First thing, I think, the priorities that we have in life. Our priority must, of course, be that God is to always come first. We are in some ways very similar to the ancient people of Israel. Often we start with good intentions and seek to honor and please God in our lives and in the actions and things that we do. But over time, the challenges of life start to intrude, and God slips down our list of priorities. Where once we joyfully woke up, for example, and the first thing we did was pray and read the Bible, now other things occupy that time. I am sure that you can think of many other examples of how the things of life, work, family, other life commitments have resulted in God losing priority in your life. But no matter our situation, God is always to come first. The people of Israel seem to have the attitude that they would give of their time and resources once they were set up and fully and properly established. But this attitude simply will not do. God is always to have number one priority. Second thing to consider, blessings. When we are faithful and obedient, we open ourselves up to God's blessing. This does not mean that God is cursing us at other times, but rather that he loves to reward those who are faithful and obedient. The third thing to consider, gratitude. All that we have or will ever have comes from God. So often we forget this and think that the material things we possess are a result of our own efforts and our own work. So let us always be grateful and not forget to voice our gratitude to our mighty God, giving him thanks for blessing us and giving us so much. I hope you will join me for lesson number 3.